I want to start off this morning with some lines from one of my favorite children's books called On the Day You Were Born. It says this: on the eve of your birth, word of your coming passed from animal to animal. While you waited in darkness, tiny knees curled to chin, the earth and her creatures with the sun and the moon all moved in their places, each ready to greet you on the very first moment, on the very first day you arrived. If we are lucky as children, this book is given to our parents so that they can read it to us over and over again. It's a story of how the universe, and in its grand majesty and promise, welcomes you into the great balance of the earth and its creatures, where the ocean and stars and even the very planets stop at that moment of your birth to welcome you to the world. It's a really wonderful story. As we grow from 1 to 5 and 5 to 10 and 10 to 15, we are told a very different story. One told to us from our parents about kind of our place, the narrative story of our place in our family, from those who have been before us, and how we step into that longer story of our intergenerational self. Recently, I found some child psychologists who were talking about, they had done this study on children and how that narrative story actually plays into who you become as an adult, kind of your ability to be resilient and understand yourself in kind of a larger belonging to the universe. And these researchers were talking about that most of us have three kind of ways that we are told that story. The first one that you could be told is an ascending storyline. It's something like this: your father came to this country dirt poor, and we were immigrants with only the clothes on our back and hands ready to work. And we made something of ourselves. We persevered, and you are part of that great lineage that you step into of how we move up with each generation, right? You've all heard that one. We could be told a descending storyline, something like this: we started off with so much, darling, bright lights, travel, and new adventures, but then circuses started fading. Television replaced people's awe with pageantry, and your grandfather's clown vocation, it lost its oomph. He got depressed, your grandmother got depressed. We were a sad clown family, and it's all been downhill since then. You see the difference? We could be told what is known as an oscillating story. Something like this: your dad was a banker, but then the recession came and he lost his job for 2 years. So I went back and I got a job at the hospital, and we prevailed in the end because we had each other. I picked up some shifts and all actually was okay. Your Uncle Joe went to college, and then he went to law school. And then one day, his wife left him a sticky note on the refrigerator saying that she was leaving him. And he came in to move in with us, and we took care of him. And all was well with him because we had each other. Now, what I found fascinating about all of those stories were psychologists will tell you that if a kid knows their intergenerational self, kind of their larger sense of belonging, that is all helpful to them, rather than not knowing that story. But the true one that really helps create kids who are resilient is the oscillating story, right? We're going to have good, we're going to have bad, but as long as we have each other, everything is okay. And what they found was, if you have that resilient story, you have a resilient child. If you have that survival story, you have a survival type child, which also then plays into adulthood along the way. But what struck me is what a huge impact that initial narrative story can have on how we respond to life. Because what do you do if you are thrown into the wrong camp? If you were told the ascending story of everything is great and it gets better with each generation, and then something happens to you, right? things don't go along that way, how do you persevere through that? What do you do when things go sour? Who do you turn to? How do you get your grounding once again? And that descending storyline, life is crap, basically. We started downhill, we're still going downhill, you're going to go downhill. After reading that, I felt kind of depressed. Which is why, thank goodness, actually, we have this month of imagination. You see, setting that kind of deterministic view next to imagination, we aren't just given the story we are inherited, but we become the storytellers, not just the story receivers. That's what imagination has to say about that narrative story that we all inherit. And it made me realize that we can be our own kind of oscillating force as adults, our own force to create and retrieve a narrative of survival and resilience. And the more I talked to people in the last week about their own stories, the more that became clear. And it made me feel kind of less depressed, actually. In fact, I was reminded through some very beautiful and heroic stories of many people that in the end, it isn't whether we are given an oscillating story or not that will determine really who we are and what we do with our life. But as adults, if we can create that oscillating story ourselves, we make ourselves resilient. We make ourselves part of a new survival kind of story of who we are. And I'm going to give you a few examples. First, there's this. I've had many friends who have what you would call that kind of a descending scale of a story, right? And it could be a myriad of different things, but often when you talk to them, they'll say such things as, you know what, my parents did the best they could for who they were. Now, it allows some space in that story when you tell it that way. It has a little bit of tenderness to the past and to the people that were a part of your story. And for me, what it gets to is that, well, this is what I've been given, but this is what I'm going to do with it, right? So, in effect, they're reimagining what is possible with a little tenderness, seems to me, about also what they can do and how powerful and important that is to add some forgiveness to who you are and some humanness to the story so we can move on ourselves. In effect, we're retrieving the oscillation in the story. Now, there's a second way to do that. And I have to say, I think the second way, we ourselves can be the oscillation to the story, the chapter that shifts the story, so to speak. And for me, this was made possible by two stories from two people that I just was blown away by kind of their ability to be able to be right in the middle of their story. And I'm very grateful to them. First, there's this story. So this last week, I asked people to send me 10 characteristics that make up their family dynamic when they are all together. When they have the kids in the room and their grandparents and everybody in the room, what happens? So one person sent me this. This is their 10 characteristics of their family. We are tender, volatile, silly, ritualistic, strict, compassionate, anxious, committed, open-hearted, fast-paced. Here's what another personer sent me. He said this: we are loud, chaotic, silly, tight, loyal, informal, unorthodox, boisterous, epicentral, and then he had in parentheses, my best one-word description for being at the center of a large disturbance. And somewhat introverted, he said. Then I got one that somebody sent me out of about 15 that I had, but somebody sent me one where they didn't really understand what I was asking for. But in what they sent me was really a powerful story in and of itself. What she sent me were 10 words to describe her life from birth all the way to where she was right now. So it was a narrative story of her life, okay? This is what she wrote in the email to me. From past to present, she wrote this: depressed, alcoholic, dismissive, silent, humorous, resilient, loving, honest, affectionate, wise. Then she wrote this: wow, what a great exercise. Okay, so there are mine from childhood to present. Yeah, and it's been a rough ride at times, but I am determined to give my daughter the childhood I wish I had had. I think a lot about legacy. My folks, both gone, did their best. They did the best with the tools that they had. They didn't know anything differently. So I set out to change the patterns of my heritage. And they showed me how I don't want to raise my child. And there are a lot of knots to untie each day. I wish it was a prettier, I loved my childhood in the white picket fence story, but it isn't. For me, it's about coming from a place of feeling disposable and unheard as a child and as a young adult, to recognize my own worth despite a history that screams to the contrary. And then giving my daughter a place where she is always heard and always loved, and help her to know that she has gifts to give the world beyond measure, that she is of worth and I am of worth. Here's the second story. A friend of mine is Korean and was adopted by a white family here in the United States. One day she started talking to me about the stories that we are told, the ones we know to be true as they kind of shape who we are as we grow up in the world. And the story that she was told about her adoption from Korea was this: that she was brought to the adoption agency in Korea in a basket with nice clothes on, with an outfit and a pin on her, like a note pinned onto the front of her chest that read, "Take care of our family. We're a poor family. You can make a difference to our child." It was a sweet story, right? A story of concern and care. Now, my friend said she always believed that story, as her parents had told it to her, and it was a nice story to be able to kind of start yourself out in the world. She didn't question it until she went to college. Now, I should also say, at this point, she showed me some burn marks that she has on her arm and on the back of her legs. And she said, you know, she was kind of telling me that, along with saying, then she went to college and she took an International Women's Studies course. And in that course, she learned that Korea, China, and Russia sent tons of female babies to the United States in the 1980s. And she realized that her story may not have been so rosy, because none of the stories she was hearing were rosy. None of them. And she realized there was a good chance that the burn marks that she had were intentional, or that she was a neglected child, not a loved one, before she was adopted. Then it turns out she had a coworker who had a niece who was about her age, who went back to Korea to really find out what the story was, who her birth parents were. And when she got there and to the adoption agency, the exact same story that my friend had been told was the exact same story that this woman's niece had been told, down exactly to the pinned card on her chest with the exact same words on it. And she said at that moment, kind of like she threw out, the myth was shattered for her. The likelihood that her burn marks were accidental and that the story her parents had told her went out the window. It sunk in that she was probably left to die somewhere, like garbage in a field or a garbage can or in the street, exactly as she had bore witness to in so many cases in her women's studies class. She says her parents probably always knew this too, but they liked believing in the story, and they wanted her to believe in it as well. And on some level, it was a compassionate thing for her parents to do that, right? But as she told her parents that story, they did not want to change it around. They wanted to hold on to that story, and she didn't. She went on to explain that actually she's very grateful for knowing the truth. It changed her own perception of herself, of who she knew herself to be at her core, that she was resilient and flexible and strong. She said her desire to leave the world a better place has always felt like it came from someplace deep in her unconscious. And if you knew her, that's all she does with her life, is constantly kind of reimagining greater things and places for people to be. Now here's the thing. Both of these stories aren't just going back in and revising the story that was told, making the story more tender through forgiveness or understanding, through revision. No, they aren't just reframing the story or reimagining. They, in effect, became the fulcrum, the hinge that sets the story on a new path forward. They become that oscillating force. For the first friend, when she imagined life with her child, she is saying, no more. Yes, that is what my past was. But I'm inserting myself in the story and imagining a new way for myself and for my child. She is that hinge, right? She is the fulcrum of oscillation. And yes, friends, I do think we can all be that fulcrum of oscillation ourselves. The second story about adoption, the same thing. She is the hinge that starts to oscillate that story. Because she is not a person who says, I am an abused, abandoned, and unwanted child. As an adult, she is saying, I am a person who can look at my very dark past and realize that that is my story, but it's not me. And that takes imagination. To change a story by saying the story is mine, but the story isn't me. That is turning yourself into that oscillating fulcrum. Finally, I don't want to end without talking about the ascending story and what you do with that, right? Because there's a third way to make your story an oscillating story even when you didn't inherit it. Not by looking back and reimagining it, but actually by imagining a different future. And here, actually, I turn to Scott because he did something really remarkable that I didn't realize was as remarkable at the time. But he did this. Scott and I go to the National Storytelling Festival often in Jonesboro, Tennessee. And it's a 13-hour haul of a drive. And sometimes we bring our kids, other times we don't. But this one time we had brought Solveig. She was probably maybe a freshman or an 8th grader. And she's in the car, and you're driving for 13 hours pretty much straight through. And at one point she says to us, you know how you can have a kid who sits right in the middle? You know what I'm talking about? So they're almost in the front seat. And she says to us, she asks this question about, will I be friends with my neighbor Julia, who I've been friends with since 2nd grade, when I go to high school or when I go to college? And she's asking this question, and Scott kind of takes it and he starts answering it. But he starts by taking that question and starts telling her the story of her life. He starts by predicting what would happen between the two of them, and then he just kept going. How they would be different, and as they hold different values now, and yes, it could be a struggle, but how she was very loyal. Solveig was very loyal to her friends, and her friendship would keep going somehow through high school, and they would remain friends. How when they got to college, Solveig would take a women's studies course, and it would make her more vigilant about her beliefs, and Julia wouldn't, and how it would make it harder to stay in the same circles. After about an hour, I kid you not, we stopped to go to the bathroom, and we all got out. We got back in, and Solveig gets in the car, and she goes, "Can you keep going?" So he does. how she would meet this cute guy in college and in calculus class, and how she really liked him a lot, but he wasn't very nice to other people, but she was wondering whether or not he was the one or not. And then it turns out he fools around on her, and she finds out, and they break up, and she's all upset, and how mom comes to college that weekend and reassures her that you can have a broken heart, but it can be fixed. And how I bring her out to a great Thai restaurant that evening. About this time, 2 hours had passed. And after 2 hours, he had sent her off to the Peace Corps in Tanzania. And her brother had just gotten his MBA and then got in a car accident that made him limp, and how Solveig would go and be with him for about 2 months in that process. And 3 hours went by, and Scott went all the way through both of our deaths, and how he died first and was in the hospital, and how his children would come and talk to him in the bright morning sun in the hospital and tell him stories. And how after that year I would be so depressed that I would paint in my studio and not want to see people, and how my children would come and paint with me and create with me as well, to hold that pain and sorrow. The last hour, after 6 hours of this epic story, he got all the way to Solveig as a grandparent, who she had actually married the clever and funny guy who she had met in a comedy club in her late 20s, and they were still together. It was an epic story. And we laughed and cried and joked and teased throughout that telling. And it was filled with sadness and hope and happiness and blessing. Finally, he finished, and I felt like we had just listened to like the best book on tape. And I remember sitting in the car thinking, wow, that was a great gift you gave her. But it wasn't until I went back and I thought more about that story that it really hit me. Scott was careful to tell the story in an oscillating way. By imagining her future, he implanted all the strength she had inside of her that made her a survivor, a resilient adult. And in the telling, he told her that we are a family that can get through life, not because we have already gotten through it, but instead it left a story in her head of how she will get through whatever comes her way. It predicted her oscillating narrative. It gave her a grounding in the best of who she could be, through tragedy and failure and sadness, as well as joy and delight. In the end, it seems to me that the story you inherit, your narrative family story, will not determine alone who you become. It just won't, unless you actually let it. What happened to me this week is a realization that it matters what we cultivate, what we mother. It matters that we cultivate our story all the time. Or we can slip back into that story that everything happens for good and you are a part of making it, or everything happens for bad and you're a part of making that as well. The truth is, it just isn't true. It matters to reframe, either by looking back into the past or looking into the future. Life and your story takes your caring for it and injecting imagination and being that oscillating force. It takes you and your imagination to get it right. So inject, reimagine, and mother your story. May it be so. Amen.
Father always promised us that we would live in France. We'd go boating on the Seine, and I would learn to dance. We lived in Ohio then, in the mines, on his streams like boats we knew. We'd sail in time. All my sisters soon were gone to Denver and Cheyenne, marrying their grown-up dreams, the lilacs and the man. I stayed behind, the youngest still, always danced alone. The colors of my father's dreams faded without a sound. And I live in Paris now. My children dance and dream, hearing the ways of a miner's life in words they've never seen. I sail my memories afar, like boats across the Seine. Watch the Paris sun setting in my father's eyes again.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.